Good afternoon. Welcome to part 2 of the MAYDAY Peace Conference. I'm Mim Sponberg-Kagel, and I have the privilege of introducing our afternoon speaker, Dr. Greg Kaster, Professor of History at Gustavus Adolphus College. Just a first word. When Ray and Florence Sponberg started this annual Peace and Justice Conference in 1981, their hope was that the overall MAYDAY theme would really call to Gustavus students as well as lifelong learners in the larger community to respond to the iconic international distress call, Mayday, 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 with its urgent implication that anyone within hearing distance of a call for help has a moral obligation to render assistance. I'm also here as a member of the board of the Friends of the Library, Gustavus Library Associates, a group that supports the Folke Bernadotte Memorial Library on the campus of Gustavus Adolphus College. For the past several years, our GLA group has had the pleasure of sponsoring a MAYDAY Lunch and Learn session with either our keynote speaker or a guest expert who can elaborate on some theme of the general convocation. This year, I'm afraid you're on your own for lunch. I have just a couple of reminders regarding the question and answers portion of the program. If you have a question, you should join the Zoom webinar and type your question in the Q&A link. The link to the Zoom webinar is found on the MAYDAY conference website at gustavus.edu/events/MAYDAY. And you can type your question or comment in at any time during the presentation. And now for Greg Kaster. Dr. Kaster has taught history at Gustavus since 1986. He's a passionate advocate for the power of the liberal arts and for encouraging students who describe his teaching as passionate, energetic, and enthusiastic to learn for the sake of learning. In 2018, he was awarded the Edgar M. Carlson Award for Distinguished Teaching, and his acceptance speech included this stirring remark: understanding who, what, when, where, and why we are, whether at the individual or social level, demands historical thinking and understanding. Everything, even death and taxes, has a history. And all of us are not only in history, but also makers of it, which means we have the potential, always constrained in some ways, to change it. It was so thrilling to hear from Jaclyn Corin this morning that young people are learning this. Dr. Kaster also conducts a podcast now in its 7th season. When asked for the one message he hopes his listeners take from hearing it, he said he hopes they see that learning for life is incredibly rewarding, if not always easy or comforting, that it is humanizing, at least potentially, and that it is essential to the never-ending work of creating and sustaining a just, healthy, and compassionate world. I can't think of anything that could be more congruent with the aim of the MAYDAY conference than that. So here, speaking on Kent, Parkland, and the history of social justice student activism in the United States is Greg Kaster.
Thank you so much, Mim, for that really generous introduction. I appreciate that. Thanks to everybody who is participating in the webinar. Thanks so much to the Gustavus Library Associates, to my colleague Glenn Cranking, Director of MAYDAY, to all the supporters of MAYDAY who make this possible, and a special thanks to Jaclyn Corin, whose talk this morning was so inspiring. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to begin with 2 quotations. One is from the Gustavian Weekly, the student newspaper, in 1968, September 6, 1968, and the other is more recent. The first quotation from the Weekly. A growing awareness of students' freedom and power has been demonstrated at the University of California, at Columbia, and at the Sorbonne in Paris. And the trend towards student activism and changing universities is expected to spread across the country this year. The role of the student is changing. For years, it has been the university which has molded the student, remaining unchanged itself in the process. Now students have liberated themselves, in many cases from institutionalism and acceptance of tradition as a viable means of dealing with problems. They have in many cases been able to fashion the institution to meet contemporary needs. And again, that was the Weekly, an editorial in the Weekly in September 1968. The second quote is just from a few days ago in an online publication called Inside Higher Ed. It's dated April 23rd, 2021. Hundreds of students at Ohio State University occupied the student union and participated in a protest in downtown Columbus Wednesday, demanding that the university cut ties with the city's police department after an officer shot and killed Ma'Khia Bryant, a 16-year-old Black girl. I'd like you to keep these two quotes in mind as we proceed. And before I turn to some specific instances of student activism for social justice in the past, let me first begin with a few disclaimers and then a couple of general points about that activism. The disclaimers first. I am not an expert in the history of student activism. I have not researched it thoroughly. I've not studied it. That's not what my specialty is. I am not really an activist either, and I wasn't as a student. I participated in some demonstrations against the Vietnam War as an undergraduate. Remember vividly participating in my first demonstration on campus at Northern Illinois University in DeKalb, and noticing that leading the protests were some of my history professors. And I thought, oh, that's another good reason to be a history major, at least for me at the time, since I opposed the war. I participated in a huge nuclear freeze march in June 12th, that famous march in New York City, and I think it was 1982, probably one of the largest ever, 1 million people. But I wasn't an activist as a student, and nor as an undergraduate or as a graduate student. But I'm interested in student activism, primarily because of when I grew up. I was born in 1953, and so came of age with the 60s, and especially the 70s. We historians talk about the long 60s. And I teach a course on the 60s at Gustavus, a first-term seminar. I also teach a course on 1968, just that one year, which I'm teaching this spring. And so I bring a kind of teacher's interest to it, as well as a personal interest. With those disclaimers stipulated, a couple of generalizations about student activism for social justice, and really student activism in general. Let me just make 5 points for you to consider. And number one, it has a long and varied history, long and varied, as we will see. Number two, the variety is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, it has been about all kinds of causes, from the most, we might think, silly to the most grand and existential, climate change today, for example. But the variety is absolutely extraordinary. Number three, if we think about activism broadly among students, we need to remember that student activists included not only liberals and radicals, but also conservatives. So if you think about the 1960s, it's easy to remember, for some of us at least, that the 1960s marked the emergence of Students for a Democratic Society with their Port Huron statement and its call for participatory democracy in all areas of life, political and economic in particular. But the 1960s, early 1960s, also marked the emergence of Young Americans for Freedom, a conservative student, young people's organization that was embracing the market, free enterprise, and definitely embracing the Cold War as well. So we need to think about, what activism are we talking about? And again, today I'll be focusing on activism by young people for social justice. The fourth point is that it's often the case that we think of student activism as involving college students only. But as Jaclyn Corin, the March for Our Lives movement, and so many others, and we'll see at least one of them when we turn to the history shortly, high school students have been involved as well, younger students. It's not just college students who have been part of this long history of student activism, including student activism for social justice in our country. And maybe in the Q&A we can get into why that focus has been so much on college and university students rather than high school students. And then the last general point I want to make is that while I'm focusing on the United States here, that's the area I teach, that this activism has been international. Never was this more clear than in 1968. And this is a picture of 60s activism at the top, March for Our Lives at the bottom. But in 68, you know, I mean, the activism was everywhere. It was not just in the United States. It was in Paris. It was in Prague, of course, the Prague Spring. It was in Tokyo. These are students in their helmets. It was in Mexico City, where students were killed. It was at Cape Town in South Africa. It was in Sweden. It was everywhere, not just the US. So, you know, if we really were to do it justice, we'd want to think about this activism in a truly transnational or international comparative context. What I'm going to do is offer first some comments about Kent State and Jackson State, and then we're going to move back in time from there to probably some activism that you're less familiar with. And then if time permits, because I want to make sure we have time for questions, I'll end with the Columbia University uprising of 1968. This is highly, you might say, idiosyncratic, highly selective. There is so much we could talk about. I mean, I could spend hours just talking about the Columbia uprising of 68. I'm not including moments, instances of student activism that some of you may know about. Why am I not doing that? Just a matter of time. So I won't be saying much at all about the Berkeley free speech movement of 1964, for example, and many others. But I think what I've tried to do is give you a sense of the range of activism among young people, activists for social justice in our country's history. So let's start with Kent State. The 50th commemoration of that was in 2020, and of course it was virtual due to COVID. I was in high school at the time. I have a vague memory, I wish I could go back in time and confirm it, that I joined some other students in occupying or marching to the principal's office and demanding that someone come to speak to us about what had happened at Kent. It was so inconceivable that students who looked like us, white students, had been shot dead on that campus. And someone did come from Kent State. I don't remember if the student, I don't know whether the student had been an activist or not, but someone eventually did come to our high school and speak about it. It's something I remember vividly, like anyone, I think, around my age at the time. I also recall I was a junior in high school, and rather than going to prom, and maybe this says more about my date prospects than my interest in history, but rather than going to prom, some buddies and I, we got into a huge debate with my dad the night of prom about Kent State and whether the shootings were justified, with my dad suggesting they were, and my friends and I suggesting not at all. In any case, a lot of us were alive then, have memories of it, even if we weren't there. But let me begin with just some observations about Kent and Parkland. They couldn't be more different. What happened at Marjory Stoneman High School, what happened at Kent State. And historians are obsessed about context. Context means so much to us. So yes, they had in common bullets, guns, right? Students killed. But really the context couldn't have been more different. As Jaclyn said so movingly this morning, right? Just another day going about their business at Marjory Stoneman, and an individual gunman opening fire and killing ultimately 17 students. Kent State, it's state-sponsored violence, right? It's the Ohio National Guard, right? With their M1 loaded rifles, it turns out, who were on campus doing the shooting. in a context of protest, of activism by Kent students. We'll get into this a bit more shortly. And so, we could go on. There are all kinds of differences. I think what unites them, though, is that, Kent State occurred in the context of student activism, and Parkland resulted in student activism, as we again heard so much about so movingly this morning from Jaclyn. So I think the basics of Kent State are probably familiar to a lot of you, if not most of you, all of you listening, right? We can do the numbers, the famous numbers: 67 seconds, right? 67 rounds, 13 seconds, and 4 students killed, 2 of whom were bystanders, not active in the protests. We probably, most of us also know that the immediate trigger of that protest, the immediate catalyst, the precipitating event, was President Nixon's announcement of the US invading Cambodia, really expanding the US conflict in Southeast Asia. Right? Those are sort of the basics that we're all, I think, or so many of us familiar with, but there's so much more to Kent State than that. And I would urge everyone to read this book. If you read just one book about Kent State, it's this book by a historian named Thomas Grace. It's called Kent State: Death and Dissent in the Long 60s. Grace doesn't like to talk about this much, but yeah, I'm going to say it anyway. He was among those students at Kent wounded. He's now a professor himself, though not at Kent State. It's a fabulous book that came out in 2020, and I'll be referencing some of his findings and really interpretations as we proceed. One of the things that Grace does so well in the book is he situates Kent State in its historical context. And where for a lot of us at the time, it seemed like, wow, how could this happen at Kent State? This seems to be coming out of the blue. As he shows, Kent was really a working class kids' college or university. Many of the students, including many of the activists, leaders among the activists in 1970, were children of Union parents. The fellow waving the flag, taunting the guard with the black flag on the cover of Grace's book was in fact the son of a United Auto Workers vice president. His point is that many of the activists and many other students at Kent came from families with histories of political activism, sort of in the union movement, the labor movement, passed down to these their children, now students at Kent. He also points out that another part of the context is the incredible political activism that had occurred at Kent since at least the early 1960s, since about 60 or 61, activism around civil rights, for example, desegregating off-campus housing. That again, the events, the tragedy at Kent wasn't simply coming out of a protest against the invasion of Cambodia. That's what precipitated it, yes, but there's so much more to the story. We also need to remember that on the night of May 1st, right, there in the city of Kent, there was breaking of windows. I mean, whether we called what happened rowdyism, doesn't matter, but that enough disturbance in Kent itself the evening of May 1st that the mayor called on Governor Rhodes, the Republican governor of Ohio, called on him to bring out the National Guard. The next day on campus, what you're looking at here, the campus of Kent, the ROTC building burned, and already the National Guard was present on Kent's campus. And as the building burned, not clear who started it, presumably an activist, most historians think, or activists. But in any case, the building burned, and as the Guard tried to protect firemen as they were putting out the fire, some activists were cutting the fire hoses, and the building was, you can see, essentially destroyed. Students called a rally for May 4th, a rally to protest the invasion of Cambodia under Nixon. But more than that, a rally to protest the presence of ROTC on campus, and to protest the presence of the Guard on campus. So the rally was never simply about the invasion of Cambodia. The administration at Kent canceled the rally, and the Guard's task, really, its charge was to make sure, I think something like, if you see more than 2 students together, make sure you break them apart. The students went ahead with the rally, and the Guard fired tear gas initially. You can see that here. And some students were throwing rocks, excrement, tear gas canisters back at the Guard. None of the students were armed, though. None of the students were armed. And there were several hundred students, student activists, but a lot of students were, maybe a couple of thousand, sort of gathered around, just kind of watching. Here again is that photo of the student waving the black flag, taunting the guardsmen who were kneeling. This student was in fact wounded. I think his name is Alan Canofo, was wounded, survived. This is, of course, the most iconic photo. I even hesitate to show it. We see it so often. This is, of course, Jeffrey Miller, who is dead, been shot dead, one of the 4 students killed on May 4th. And Mary Vecchio, who was, she's often identified as a runaway. She wasn't a Kent student. There screaming, kneeling over him, screaming for help. The photograph was taken by a Kent student, John Philo. He won the Pulitzer Prize for it, as you may know, and went on to, I think he may still be in charge of photography for CBS television. This is a picture that not everyone sees. It's, we're probably familiar with the previous one, but this is a picture of the Guard, at least some of them, gathered around Jeffrey Miller's body. The students killed: Sandy Scheuer, Bill or William Schroeder, Allison Krauss, and Jeffrey Miller. Now, this is kind of often where the Kent State story stops, right? It's a tragedy. These 2 students and 2 activist students and 2 other students shot dead by the Ohio Guard on a campus in the United States of America in 1970. All white students, all unarmed. How could this happen? But there's more to think about with respect to Kent. And I come back here to Thomas Grace's terrific book. It's not just that we need to understand the larger context, not only what was happening in Kent on May 1st in town that led the mayor to call the governor and ask for the Guard, and the governor to send the Guard to campus, but we need to also understand, as Grace does, what's happening nationally at the time, right? The kind of violence that had existed in the 1960s, long before Kent. Just think of the assassinations, but the familiar ones come to mind: John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, but also Malcolm X, Black Panther Bobby Hutton. There were others as well. The Nazi leader, neo-American Nazi leader, George Lincoln Rockwell, assassinated. And then just the violence associated with urban unrest, especially in 1967, 160 some cities erupting, famously in Detroit and Newark, for example. And then the number of bombings that had taken place prior to 1970, basically the year and a half before Kent State, before this tragedy, there were several thousand bombings, federal facilities and corporations by radicals, not all of them students, but by radicals. And those bombings claimed a total of 43 lives. So by the time the Guard comes to campus at Kent State, there's concern among residents in Kent, among Kent administrators, and among Americans generally, the broader public, concern about what is happening to the country. Right? It feels like it's unraveling, the ongoing violence, not just in Southeast Asia, but at home as well. We need to understand all of that, and Grace really does a good job of that in his book. But we also need to understand the aftermath, right? What comes later. And most immediately, and for me still incredibly, what happens is a nationwide student strike. I think it's certainly the largest student strike, I think, still in our country's history. And this is a poster advertising it. Remember, there's no internet, there are no cell phones, none of the social media, but literally the next day, thousands of students, I think maybe 800 campuses, again, huge number of campuses across the country are on strike, including at Kent. And here's another example, the bullet holes and the peace symbol. Amherst College in Massachusetts, right? National student strike to begin today. It's on May 5th. And then at Gustavus as well. Students went to the Student Senate and wanted to protest what had happened at Kent. And the Student Senate agreed, and so there was the strike. This comes from the Gustavian yearbook, this picture, students sort of holding a memorial, visual, speakers. So just all over the country, almost immediately, right, this reaction, protest by students against what had happened at Kent. This is at the University of Minnesota, the strike there. But there's more to the long-term, right, more to the sort of outcome of Kent if we look at the long-term effects. And again, I'm drawing on Grace's terrific book here. And he points out that you can think about Kent as a tragedy, which it indeed was, right? But you can also think about some of the concrete changes that came out of that tragedy. And almost immediately, they weren't super long-term. But they took a little longer than just 24 hours. And what were they? Well, he points to three in particular. He argues that Nixon ended the invasion into Cambodia sooner than he probably would have. He announces it in April. It's done, right? Ended, he announces in June of 1970. Number two, what he also points to as a kind of concrete outcome is that it's in 1973, Congress passes the War Powers Act, right, which is aimed to restrict the president's ability to wage war without Congress declaring war. And we can get into a discussion about, you know, how effective that's been, but that is certainly a concrete outcome, Grace argues, of what happened at Kent. And then number three, he points to the 26th Amendment, which was passed by Congress and ratified in 1971, allowing 18-year-olds to vote, which I remember well, voted in that election in 1972. And by the way, that amendment passed, I think it was ratified in 2 months. I don't think, no amendment in US history has been ratified by the states so quickly. Sometimes, just as an aside, sometimes Ohio is credited as the 38th state making ratification happen. I think the National Archives, though, has North Carolina as the 38th due to paperwork primarily. In any case, Grace points to these three concrete outcomes coming out of Kent. But he also argues, and other scholars have argued this as well, that the other thing that the tragedy shows, that it added to, reflected, intensified, and reflected, didn't cause, but because this was already underway, certainly since at least 68, was this intense polarization in this country. And it's a polarization we're still living with. It's waxed and waned a bit, but it's back with a great intensity, I would argue, and the others would argue. And we need to remember, how many Americans at the time, in letters to the editor, for example, in ordinary Americans, not just officials, but how many Americans thought that the students at Kent got what they deserved? And, you know, there were slogans like, you know, National Guard 4, students 0, or they should have killed 400, right? It's hard to remember that, at least for me, someone who was so appalled at the time, people like me, but it's incredibly important to remember that. And so, you know, Chase is asking us to think about not just what happened at Kent between May 1st and May 4th and on May 4th, but what came before it and what came after it. I think that's all quite important and useful. Of course, people involved in events, whether you're an activist or not, grow up. This is Mary Vecchio and John Philo, the photographer of that iconic image, fairly recent photo. And just coincidentally, as I was preparing for this talk, in the Washington Post, some of you may have seen it, there was a profile of Mary Vecchio. You know, what is she up to all these years later? And she's living in Florida and still dealing with the trauma, still dealing with how her life was changed, not just by what happened at Kent to Jeffrey Miller, whose body she's kneeling over, but also by the photograph itself. And this gets us into the whole issue of how student activism, and particularly student activism for social justice, is remembered. How should we remember it? That's not the point of my talk here. Again, we might get into that in the Q&A if you like, but that's important, right? How do we remember it, and how do we make sure it's not misremembered? How do we commemorate it? What do we learn from it? And this is a memorial. I have not been there. I know some of you listening no doubt have. I have not, but and there are other. My understanding is there are other memorials as well at Kent. But just that issue of remembering, right, and how we remember, I think, is incredibly important to keep in mind. Speaking of remembering, right, it's the case that 10 days later or so at Jackson State University in Mississippi, there was another state-sponsored shooting. When I state sponsored, I mean, you know, officially, right, people doing the shooting acting in an official state capacity. In this case, it's not the National Guard, it's state troopers and Jackson, Mississippi police. And Mississippi at the time certainly was the most racist state in the country. This is Jackson State, a Black university. Now, what happened at Jackson State is that for a long time on a road named Lynch Avenue, which cut through the campus, there were interactions, shall we say, between Black students and white motorists passing through, with white motorists harassing the students, and the students sort of fighting back, maybe throwing rocks or hurling epithets, whatever it may be. And on May 14th, this kind of tension between the white motorists and Black students escalated. Police were called to campus. There was a dump truck that was set on fire, probably by the students who were protesting, yes, what had happened at Kent State, yes, the war, but primarily they were protesting what was happening on their campus as white motorists drove through and continually harassed the Black students at Jackson State. The way it was interpreted at the time, this is a famous Herblock cartoon. Some of you may be old enough to remember his cartoons. I certainly do. That they were, Kent and Jackson were essentially equivalent, right? They were, you know, sort of both about students being killed, both about students protesting. They really weren't equivalent. They're really quite different. There's a terrific historian named Nancy Bristow, University of Puget Sound, who has a almost brand new book out about Jackson State. And she makes the point very clearly, I think quite persuasively, that the way to understand what happened at Jackson State, you know, why did police turn and fire on unarmed students? And these are photos of particular dorm windows with the bullet holes, that we can't understand that apart from the history, the long history of, again, state-sponsored violence against Black people, including Black students. Even before this, even before Kent, in Orangeburg, South Carolina, there had been another instance of violence against Black students who were protesting for civil rights. So it's not just that Jackson State is easily forgotten, too easily forgotten in the shadow of Kent for white students, but it's also that when Jackson State is remembered, it's sort of misremembered, right, as kind of a lesser Kent State, but it was not. It wasn't that. It was a significant moment in the long ongoing history of Black people, in this case, Black students, resisting oppression, resisting white supremacy. And I think we need to remember that. There is memory. These are the two students killed. On the right is James Earl Green, he was a high school student. Philip Lafayette Gibbs on the left was I believe was a law student, Jackson State student. There were several others wounded as well, just as there were 4 killed at Camp 9 wounded. You know, we think about the people killed, but also people who were wounded as well and have to live with that memory or even the effects of the wounds the rest of their lives. At Jackson State, you find this sign, part of the Mississippi Freedom Trail. Tragedy struck Jackson State, et cetera, et cetera. It mentions the students by name. Law enforcement had massed at the college. These were mostly all white Mississippi State troopers and some Jackson police, massed at the college to subdue students, protesting harassment from whites driving through campus. As Bristow argues in her book about Jackson State, what the police and other officials called a quote unquote riot among Black students there was really anything but. I mean, you know, there was a burning dump truck and students throwing rocks and verbally harassing white drivers, but nothing on the scale of what that word riot connoted, certainly at the time. In any case, again, it's important not just to remember Jackson State, but to also remember it in its proper historical context, which I think Nancy Bristow's book does so well. So let's move back in time, because as I've said, there's a long and varied history of student activism and student activism for social justice. Let's start with a kind of, you know, in a way, silly piece of that history. Not silly to the students involved at the time, but perhaps silly to us. And this is the Great Butter Rebellion at Harvard. I don't know whether Jaclyn, as a Harvard student now, knows about this history, but this photo is from, or this image is from an article some years ago in the Harvard Gazette about student unrest at Harvard in the pre-Civil War years. And a lot of it was around food, right? And so as far as we know, this is the earliest known protest by American college students. It's 1766 at Harvard. And as was the case, the food, right, wasn't so great. At dinner one night, a Harvard student happened to be I think it was the grandfather, Asa Dunbar is his name, the grandfather of the future dissenter, Henry David Thoreau. This student sort of stood up and proclaimed, and I quote, "Behold, our butter stinketh. Behold, our butter stinketh." And what ensued was essentially a food fight on the part of these students. It led ultimately to about half the student body being suspended.
And it looks like, Greg, we may have you muted. I think he might be, maybe his earbuds ran out. I'm going to text him here.
For African American people. Oops, I want to. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yep, we can hear you now.
Okay, good. I just, for some reason, I got a message that I wasn't being heard. I don't know what that meant. But as long as
Yeah,
you can
yes,
so,
yeah.
Okay, great. So the Lane seminary debate, Lane was, as I said, Lane was a Presbyterian seminary. And at Lane were a bunch of students, right? including this fellow, one of my heroes, Theodore Dwight Weld, one of the most important white abolitionist agitators of the pre-Civil War period. And these students decided at Lane to have a debate, actually a series of debates. They went on for days and hours and hours. And they were debating whether to support colonization, to colonize emancipated slaves elsewhere out of the United States, or to support abolitionism. Well, they were abolitionists, so we know where they came down. The trustees of Lane and the president of Lane, the famous Presbyterian preacher Lyman Beecher, wanted to shut this down. It was bad for Lane's reputation. It was bad. This was in Cincinnati, Ohio, by the way. And the students were furious at this attempt at what they saw as censorship by the administration. This is a sign commemorating it. And what the students did was they sought what was called dismission. They sought permission to leave Lane. And about 75 students did leave Lane, including Theodore Weld. And some of them went, by the way, to Oberlin. It was then called Oberlin Intercollegiate something seminary, what became Oberlin College. But this is what they said in their statement about why they were leaving, and I quote, "We leave because the authorities above us have asserted the right to suspend free discussion upon their own arbitrary wills," end quote. And as so often the case with abolitionism, when abolitionists were denounced and silenced, that actually helped convert some people to the cause. Even if you didn't care about Black people or slavery, you cared about free speech. And this is kind of an example of that. But in any case, this is student activism in the 1830s around the issue of slavery. In some ways, it foreshadows what happens at the University of California, Berkeley in 1964, where you have students engaged in the free speech movement, protesting the university authorities there, silencing students, preventing them from talking about civil rights and mostly civil rights, a little bit about the Vietnam War as well. Coincidentally, one of our alums, who's now a professor of history, visiting professor at Carleton, Mike Gierek, that's Mike Gierek with me on the right. Mike Gierek is a leading scholar now of, got his doctorate from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He's a leading scholar of abolitionism among students, college students before the Civil War, both in the US and in England in particular. And this African-American student, John Russworm, was attending Bowdoin College, and as Mike points out, famously gave the commencement speech in which he lauded the Haitian Revolution of the late 1790s, early 1800s as an example of what Black people were capable of when Haiti not only declared its independence from France, but eliminated slavery in the process as well. Student activism you're probably less familiar with. In 1968 in East Los Angeles, about 15,000, we would say, I guess, Latinx students, they would say Chicano at the time or Mexican American, walked out of their high schools. 15,000, I think the largest, still maybe the largest single student protest, huge numbers. And they called it Blowout. This is a very good book about that activism. Historians call it Walkout. Students called it Blowout, but they walked out for several days. They were demanding that Mexican American culture and history be taught. They were demanding that the school board do something about the high dropout rate. They were demanding that incompetent teachers be fired. And while nothing came of these demands in the end, the movement, historians recognize, and Sal Castro among them, that the movement really helped to further this Chicano La Raza movement, the Chicano identity movement. And again, most of us haven't heard of it, right? But high school students, these are just some examples, Viva La Raza, of this movement. The police were called out. No one was killed, but the police were there, and there were people arrested, as in this photographer and one of the protesters at Belmont High School. This was part of high school activism all across the country. This is a cartoon. We don't know the exact, at least I don't know the exact date, probably late 60s, 68, 69, 70, but it's a cartoon from the High School Independent Press Service. Maybe hard to see, but over on the left, over on the right, you can see, it's actually, the image is reversed, sorry. But on the right, you see a high school administrator stepping on, right, the neck of a high school student. And over on the left, high school students unite, black and white students, right, with the fists out. And just reminding us that activism in the 60s and into the 70s, and it's still true, right, was among high school students, not simply college students. At Gustavus as well, you had students demanding, in this case, black students, that their history and culture be taught. And this is in 1968, where black students petitioned for a new course in Afro-American culture and history, and they got it. They managed to get 600 petitions very quickly, as this article in the student newspaper pointed out. And that course was then offered, and a whole Afro-American culture series was created as well. Another bit of student activism that's new to me just as of a few weeks ago, because this article by a historian named Mark, M-A-R-C Stein, just came out in an online publication called Out History. Mark Stein's a leading scholar of gay rights, gay activism. But at Bucks County Community College in Pennsylvania, about maybe 30 miles outside of Philadelphia, there was the largest gay rights demonstration prior to Stonewall in New York City in 1969. And the demonstration was over the college forbidding students to bring this gentleman, Richard Leach, L-E-I-T, sometimes it's S-C-H, here it's C-H, but he was president of the gay rights organization, the Mattachine Society of New York, invited to campus to speak, accepted. And the president of the community college nixed it. And students began to protest peacefully, right? Very peacefully, very civilly, but protesting nonetheless. And there were estimates that there were about 200 students involved, which makes it, again, probably that we know of the largest gay rights demonstration prior to Stonewall. And again, these are just some pictures from that article by Mark Stein. I want to end just briefly and then open it up for questions with some comments about this extraordinary event that occurred at Columbia University in 1968. We can think about what happened at Berkeley in the 60s, University of Wisconsin-Madison, University of Minnesota, and other schools, Michigan, all important. But this is an incredible student uprising at Columbia, an Ivy League school, right, in 1968, New York City. And for a long time, again, context, Columbia students had been protesting around civil rights issues. They've been protesting to get workers at the university unionized. They've been protesting against the war, protesting the university's ties to something called the Institute for Defense Analysis, which they felt linked Columbia to what was happening in Southeast Asia, the US conflict there. But then in the spring of 1968, just all hell broke loose. And what happened, this is an earlier call for a rally. You can see the activism predating 68. But what happened in the spring is that Columbia undertook to encroach even more on Harlem. If you've been to Columbia, I've been there more than a few times. You go, it's essentially in Harlem, and it was encroaching and encroaching and encroaching on the community's property. In this case, a city-owned park, and it wanted to build a gym. And both community members and students, black and white, sought to prevent that from happening. This is a group of Columbia students tearing down the fence around the construction site. The students were also at the same time demanding, as I said, an end to the university's ties to the Institute for Defense Analysis. The university responded by seeking to punish student activists involved in the gym protests and other protests. And long story short, something extraordinary occurs at Columbia in the spring of 1968, which is students, black students in one dorm, Hamilton Hall, white students, initially they were together, but then white students agreed, urged by black students to leave. So we had one dorm with black students and then other buildings. They're essentially occupied by Columbia students and turned into communes. Sort of self-governing democratic communes. And this is a picture of students sort of hanging out the laundry, right? At one of those buildings in 68. Here's a sign from one of the communes. This office has been 1, liberated, 2, cleaned, keep it that way. When the police moved in to remove the students, more on that in a second, a lot of stuff was trashed, and those photographs convinced people, you see those students, they just went in, they trashed these buildings. Far from it. These were very organized, orderly, and again, small d democratic communes. This is the Black students at Hamilton Hall at Columbia. This is inside kind of the food pantry at one of the communes. Students sleeping in the Hamilton Hall commune. What happened eventually is that the university administrators called in the New York City Tactical Patrol Force, and the TPF. Those were absolutely not the police you wanted to confront. They were literally big guys, tall, strong. The picture looks sort of quaint, right? The way they're not, in full military gear the way we see police today. But what they did was they allowed the Black students to come out peacefully because they didn't want to have Harlem erupt in protest. But the white students, they went in and just went after them, right? Yanked them out, really forcibly pulled them out, kind of like a police riot. And lots of students were bloodied. Even some conservative students watching this, they were part of the majority coalition, were incredibly angry at the police action. One of those students, conservative students, was a future governor of New York, George Pataki, who writes about how he changed sides overnight as a result of the police action. And then there ensued a long student strike at Columbia. Some classes moved outside, as you can see here. Jerry Garcia, the Grateful Dead, playing here. More protests here at the strike protest. And it was an extraordinary moment. And the students got all 3 of their major demands met. There was the university severed its ties with the Institute for Defense Analysis. The gym was not built. And there was amnesty for the students that the college, the university had previously sought to punish. It's easy to stop there, but we can't. We have to remember that activism continues. It's not limited to the 1960s, neither before, right? No, it's not just the 1960s. All kinds of activism continues after 68. This is at Gustavus, students protesting apartheid in South Africa, the divestment movement, and maybe 120 colleges and universities did divest. I don't think Gustavus had that much, maybe 20,000. I'm trying to remember exactly, but in any case, a huge movement to bring pressure to bear on companies doing business in South Africa, and then that way bring pressure to bear on the apartheid regime there. Activism around sustainability and climate change ongoing at Gustavus to this day, with the Gustavus Greens love their logo, and of course with Greta Thunberg as well. And so activism continues in all kinds of ways. And I just want to end with another quote from that same editorial in the Gustavus Weekly, and then we can move to questions and or comments. And the way that Gustavus Weekly editorial ended, the one I began with, is this way, and I quote, "Creative ideas and dynamic effort will overcome more obstacles than a beer and sex mentality. The latter is an easy way of using freedom. The former is difficult. It demands a questioning of everything which has been accepted unthinkingly in the past, and it demands a rejection of ideas and actions which do not stand up to critical evaluation. Unfortunately, some students cannot stand up to that challenge. The name of the game is freedom, but it's not much of a game after all. It's life and death." Thank you so much for listening. Happy to take questions. Megan, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Kaster. I love how this morning Jaclyn talked about her experience or inexperience in gathering and putting together a protest. And from what you showed us, Dr. Kaster, throughout history, there was no manual on how to protest, but these students were no less effective and meaningful than what we're seeing from student activists now.
That's right.
Hi, everybody. My name is Megan Myrie Grace, and I am a 2011 Gustavus graduate. And Greg, you said you weren't too much of a activist or protester. I was heavily involved in I Am We Are at Gustavus during my
Oh,
time
yeah.
there, the social
Great.
justice theater troupe. So
Yeah.
experienced in that. I am also currently the Friends of the Library, Gustavus Library Associates Board President, and I'm so excited for this Q&A time with you, Greg. The Friends of the Library are thrilled to once again sponsor this portion of May Day. And while we would love to be in person, enjoying lunch, as Mim said earlier, it was wonderful to hear from you today. And mostly, I just get to hear your voice on the Learning for Life podcast. So now we get to ask you questions, which I'm
Yes.
thrilled about. We do have about 15 minutes, give or take, as long as questions last. Time for questions. If you have a question, as a reminder for those who are listening, please join the Zoom webinar and type your question in the Q&A link you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can find the link to the Zoom webinar on the Mayday conference website at gustavus.edu/events/Mayday. Feel free to type your question and or if you have experience, Greg and I were talking earlier, if you have experience as a student activist, either at Gustavus or somewhere else, feel free to share those experiences in the Q&A as well, and we can read those. So we have had a few questions come in, Dr. Kaster, so I'll just kind of jump in with where we're at right now. You know, one of the things that people were talking about is the fact that oftentimes student activism is short-lived. One of the constants of school life is that students graduate and move on. Is there a trend of how successful protests, those that end up leading to change, are able to move against that short-lived nature?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think Jaclyn spoke to that a bit this morning. She, it's not only that students graduate, right? It's also that this work is exhausting, and it takes courage in all kinds of ways, and you sometimes need a break, as she mentioned. So, I think what can happen, what has happened, not always, but what can happen is that as student leaders leave, right, they're sort of grooming, right, trying to make sure that there are people in place who can continue the activism, the cause. But we also have to remember, as I said, these folks grow up, and contrary to myth, right, contrary to stereotypes, right, how many times, if only I had $1 for every time someone cites Jerry Rubin to me, Jerry Rubin, who was an activist in the Yippie, in Chicago in '68, became a stockbroker. The fact of the matter is that so many of the young people who are activists remain involved in some kind of way around social justice issues. And so if we look at it that way, it's a different way than, oh my gosh, they move on and the activism stops. I think it's really important to bear that in mind. So many people, it's not that they're necessarily out there protesting, but they might be working in mental health or social work or around housing issues. And Jaclyn mentioned this herself, I think this morning, how she might want to go into public interest law or something like that, and educational policy. So there's, I think, more continuity sometimes than we realize if we focus just on, okay, these leaders have graduated, now it's all over. It's not the case. I mean, activism waxes and wanes. It was certainly intense in the 1960s, but it also persists, right? Even if it's sort of quiet and subterranean at times.
Great, thank you so much. We do have a question from an anonymous attendee who asks, how does this history, what you were talking about, fit into a larger concept of a right to protest? So in other words, what gives one group a greater right to demonstrate in their own way versus another? Specifically thinking about the differences between the responses by the police in Kent versus the January 6th event in 2020.
Yeah, no, that's an incredibly important question, right? We have a right to protest. It's in the Bill of Rights, right? We all have that right. And I think one of the lessons of Kent and also Jackson State and so much of at least student activism for social justice, right? For change, for fundamental change around issues of equality, civil democracy. One of the lessons is that the state, meaning those in charge, will not hesitate to use the law and even violence, even deadly violence, to crush dissent and to stop or to prevent us from exercising that right, which we all have, regardless of our persuasion, right? Now, do we have a right to protest, violently and kill? Right, that's where things get a little not murky, but that's where we get into other issues. But we all have a right to assemble peaceably and protest. Okay, but the other, and just think, by the way, this question reminds me, right? Current, I can't remember how many, 30 some states, I believe, including Minnesota. But I think ours is no longer alive. And they're all, this is not a partisan statement, it's a factual statement. These are GOP-led efforts, Republican Party-led efforts at the state level to essentially criminalize protest, right? To make it really scary to protest. So for example, if you've read the papers or listened to the news, I'm protesting somewhere in a particular state, and if a motorist runs me down because I'm blocking traffic, no problem, right? And what this is clearly designed to do is to make people afraid to protest. So we have that right. And I think, like anything, if we don't exercise that right, we lose it. And we'd like to think that something like Kent State will never happen again. We hope that it will never happen again, but it happens. I mean, violence, there are all kinds of other ways, other instances. Columbia in '68 is just one. Madison, right, in the '70s, University of Wisconsin-Madison, where violence was used, sometimes used by the protesters, right? But also by the state to crush dissent.
Yeah, and there's a question around what have historians recognized as a breaking point for wider protests? So the question is, do historians ever ask the question about why the Kent State massacre didn't lead to wider protests? Why weren't the parents of those students rising up? What's that breaking point for greater change?
Great question. One of the other things that Thomas Grace does in his, again, I can't recommend that book highly enough. He points out that contrary to the sort of standard narrative about Kent, well, dissent was crushed, that was the end of dissent. It's not true. In fact, he points out, makes an argument with evidence, right, that dissent at Kent and nationally continued, right? It continued, though, in a context of polarization. We are still, in that context. I think it's clear we are. But this idea that somehow Kent, that the shootings, right, there went dissent. No. I mean, even at Kent itself, there were continual protests and dissent activism around, for example, the Vietnam War. They continued until the mid '70s, until the war ended. And so for many people, young people, college students and university students, what Kent did was just galvanize them even more, right? It actually fueled student activism, even in the face of criticism from Nixon. Governor Rhodes had referred, even before the shootings, had referred to the students as brown shirts, and the usual language, anarchists, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I mean, for historians, we're interested in change over time. We're also interested in continuities, and there's a continuity to the student activism. Again, it can wax and wane, but it did not disappear after Kent at all. So I don't think that there's a point where we say, well, it was crushed and that was the end of it.
Yeah. You continued to mention how similar emotionally and politically the environment of the late '60s is to kind of where we're at now. What can we learn from history about ways a climate can be de-escalated and not lead to violence?
Also a great question, to which I don't have the answer. I teach a course on the Civil War at Gustavus. And by the way, quick plug, some of you know, right? Gustavus produced the greatest living Civil War historian, James M. McPherson, Pulitzer Prize winner. Look, think about Lincoln as president. He assumes office, some states have already seceded, and he gives that magnificent first inaugural address, right? And it's all conciliatory, right? I mean, he's, not going to compromise on the Republican Party platform. Slavery cannot be extended any more than where it currently exists. But, you read that famous first inaugural and you think, well, yeah. And what was the answer, right? The answer was, basically F you, right? More states seceded and the Civil War ensued. That all comes out of an incredibly polarized decade, the 1850s. And I'm not sure how that could have been avoided. And I'm not sure how we can solve it right now. I wish I knew the answer, right? Historians looking back at the 1850s have sometimes said, well, if only those abolitionists hadn't been there, right, at Lane and elsewhere. Well, we just know that's not true. There's a whole bunch of scholarship that shows abolitionists didn't cause the Civil War, right? What caused the Civil War was two sides with fundamentally different understandings of slavery and fundamentally different understandings of the U.S. Constitution, whether it was pro-slavery or anti-slavery. And each side, this is what scares me about our current moment, each side coming to see the other as completely illegitimate. And if we could at least get beyond that, I think we might have a chance where we can agree. But it's hard when it involves an issue you feel is right or wrong, right? That's really tough to do. So I don't know. I think a lot about the 1850s. I think a lot about that question. I don't have the answer. I also know as a historian, this idea that once upon a time we all got along and everything was wonderful. Really? So I tell my students, you want to go back to the 1850s where Sumner was caned nearly to death on the floor of the Senate? You want to go back to the 40s and 30s where, there were duels? And I mean, if only Alexander Hamilton had a Twitter account or something, right? Or Aaron Burr. So we got to be careful not to think, we move, but there is this, we are very polarized. It certainly comes out of 68, I would argue, and Kent too. And I just don't know. I'm very worried about it though.
Yeah. Well, and you're right in line with some of our attendees right now. Someone put just a comment into the chat as well, saying, thank you for talking about the context, which is so important to understanding each of these events and how they've occurred.
Yes.
They said not to forgive any kind of tragedy for the way it occurred or what happened, but to understand why someone could possibly think differently than ourselves in those moments. So that was also in there as well. Let's see, another question that we have is why have histories of student activism in the U.S. focused primarily on college students? You mentioned this throughout, that there was a lot of high school student activism as well. So why would it be more focused on the college age versus the high school student age?
Yeah, that's another important question, and that's one dear to my heart. I mean, again, if we had more time, there is so much activism at the high school level and even at the kind of grade school level at times, believe it or not. But why? Well, I think part of the answer is, historians are drawn to big dramatic events. And if we think of the 1960s, the dramatic protests, let's say Berkeley in 64, the free speech movement, Columbia in 68 and elsewhere. That's where they were happening. They were happening on university campuses. Those were the protests that got most of the national attention as well. And so, for example, Mark Stein, who writes about, this isn't high school, but the Bucks County Community College, that was covered locally, right? And he only happened to recently, come upon that. So a lot of the high school protests were covered locally, not nationally. So in addition to historians being drawn to these sort of, epic seeming events that were occurring on university campuses, there's the issue of the media coverage as well. And it's also the case that a lot of the high school protests, you see that in East Los Angeles, the example I gave, wasn't, it hasn't necessarily been around the Vietnam War. But if you think of the 60s, one thinks of civil rights, the Vietnam War. Okay, where are those protests? Well, a lot of them are happening on university campuses. But more and more work is being done, some really good work about high school activism. I use a kind of fun article about in Texas, a high school student who's refuses to cut his hair, right? I mean, it's not that long, but too long for the school board and the school authorities. His case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And it's a mixed decision for the school board. But, you know, I mean, that has nothing to do with the war, really. It's an individual student. But, you know, it's activism nonetheless. So I think it's, you know, where historians focus, and we need to, as some historians are, we need to focus not just on the universities, not just on the big name, the elite universities. There's that bias as well. But we need to focus on Gustavus, for example, and high schools as well, where there was always important activism occurring. But yeah, that's an important question.
Wonderful. Thanks for that, Dr. Kaster. We do have time for one more question before we get you off to your next class. But this is from Sean Hinnenkamp. Asks, how can universities and colleges better facilitate dialogue so that students feel their voices and ideas are heard? Not in an effort to eliminate student protests, but rather to not react to them so poorly.
Yeah, again, these are all excellent questions. Let me just preface my reply. It's not really an answer, I guess, but my reply, my thoughts, by saying that so much of the activism by students before the 60s, during the 60s, and since has been about essentially has been about students wanting to make their high school, as that one cartoon I showed, or their campus more democratic, right? As well as more inclusive, more just, but also more democratic in the sense of students wanting not just a little say, a major say, an almost equitable say, right, in what is done at their high school, at the college. So I mean that's a really, really important issue that Sean is getting at. Clearly having, you know, avenues of dialogue important, right, and having administrators who maybe know a little bit of this history and are willing to listen, right, and who aren't condescending. So often, and Jaclyn this morning got at this a little bit, I think, in one of her comments. But so often, I think one of the questions: how can young people have credibility? So often, young activists, student activists, are met with condescension by those in charge, right, and the authorities. Well, it's just students acting out. It's spring. What do you expect, you know? Or and to not respond that way, but to listen and to think about how administrators and the students, right, and the faculty as well, right, can collaborate, can speak to one another in constructive ways, and that students have a way of not just being heard, but of actually being influential. I think all that's important, and I think we have some of that at Gustavus, right? We have a ways to go. Every place does, but anyway, it's a good question. It's ongoing.
Yeah, as you said earlier, it continues.
It continues. It persists. No matter what happens. No matter. Yeah, let's just say this, right? That student activism, however imperfectly, however incompletely, it pressures the United States, right, and other parts of the world in the U.S. to live up to our ideals, right? It does, and for all the condescension, for all the violence, for all the legislation, whatever it persists. It hasn't gone away. It waxes and wanes, but it doesn't go away, and it's not going to go away. Yeah. And it's an incredibly important part of our history.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah.
Well, Dr. Kaster, thanks so much again for sharing your knowledge and expertise. I know you said you weren't a scholar, but I know will be taking a lot of this with me and you know, remembering this history as we continue to see these student protests and hopefully continue to start seeing and continuing to see some change. And I know the rest of the audience will take much more with them as well. Again, this event, this portion of May Day, was sponsored by Friends of the Library, which Mim mentioned at the top of the session, which Friends of the Library, Gustavus Library Associates, is a friends organization that supports the Folke Bernadotte Memorial Library at Gustavus and the students and faculty through fundraising and awareness and really providing resources and research and technology campus-wide. If you wish to stay continue to stay connected with Friends of the Library, feel free to follow us on Instagram or Facebook. You can also head to our website at gustavus.edu/GLA. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us for the 2021 May Day Peace Conference. And thanks again, Greg. It was wonderful to hear from you and continue to learn from you. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, Megan, and everybody. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.